in public session. I want to particularly welcome all of our witnesses. Today we'll come around to you in a moment to hear your opening remarks and say hello properly. Apologies for the delayed start of the meeting. It's a particularly busy day in Leinster House today, as you'll probably be aware. There's a number of votes, etc., taking place, and a vote just took place a few moments ago, so we were a little bit delayed getting back to the committee room to start the proceedings. We have some apologies received for today's meeting. Members of the committee, Senator Vincent Martin sends his apologies, as does Deputy Jennifer Carroll MacNeill, and we received apologies from Deputy Farrell. And I just want to say, on behalf of the committee, condolences to Deputy Farrell on the death of his father on Saturday. I think the funeral may be taking place today and tomorrow. Housekeeping for the meeting, just to remind members and to witnesses who won't be familiar or as familiar with proceedings, just to mute your mobile phones or ideally put them on airplane mode, because it can interfere with the recording. Even if it doesn't appear to at the time, it can play up afterwards with the sound system, so to be aware of that. We have some members joining us online also, and you're very welcome. And just in terms of online housekeeping, the usual rules: if you could try to mute yourself when you're not speaking, and remember to unmute when you are speaking, just so that we can the meeting flows smoothly. Okay. So the purpose of our meeting today, I look forward to what I think will be a very interesting discussion, and the topic is an examination of the present approach to sanctions for possession of certain amounts of drugs for personal use. And I suppose that's a little bit long-winded way of saying decriminalisation, or is the current approach of sanctions, including legal sanctions, working appropriate, or should there be other methods considered, or other indeed approaches considered? So I'm going to welcome our witnesses, and you might just give it a wave so I know who's who when I call you out. Dr. Garrett McGovern, very good, you're very welcome. Dr. McGovern from the Priority Medical Clinic in Dundrum. Professor Bobby Smyth, good afternoon, Professor, from the Cannabis Risk Alliance. Dr. Hugh Gallagher from the specialising in addiction medicine, also of the Cannabis Risk Alliance. Mr. Tynan. You're very welcome, Mr. Tynan, Executive Director for Patients for Safe Access, and Mr. Martin Condon, Director Patients for Safe Access. And then online we have Mr. Minish, a board member of Crainn. I'm pronouncing that correctly, I am. Crainn, like the trees, I imagine. And then we're delighted to have an international guest at today's meeting, looking forward to the benefit of your experience, Dr. Capaz, Director of the Portuguese Dissuasion Commission. So that's, I think, particularly interesting to see what's been done elsewhere. It's often good practice to look abroad and see what's worked or hasn't worked elsewhere. Just a short note on parliamentary privilege. So witnesses and members are reminded of long-standing parliamentary practice that you should not criticise or make charges against any person or entity by name or in such a way as to make him, her or it identifiable, or otherwise engage in speech that might be regarded as damaging to the good name of the person or entity. If your statements are potentially defamatory in relation to an identifiable person or entity, you will be directed by me to discontinue your remarks, and it is imperative that does occur that you will comply with that direction. For those participating remotely, the same advice applies, with the added caveat that even though we're doing hybrid meetings now for some time, it is as yet untested what degree of privilege extends across an internet connection. So I suppose, just as I often say, it's really just good manners, and don't disparage people who are not present. I cannot reply. Now, the format of the meeting, the way we operate the meetings is we invite short opening statements from each organisation that comes before us. We've set that at 3 minutes per organisation. That might seem short, but there will be ample time over the course of the meeting to come back in several times. So what we do is we go through each organisation with 3 minute slots. We hear your opening remarks to set the scene and get an idea of where you're coming from. And then we go to the members in the order which they've indicated. And when we go around the tables of the members, it's generally a 7 minute slot per member. And the member can use that to make a 7 minute monologue, or they can use it for 7 1 minute rapid fire questions and answers. It's up to really to each member how they choose to use their time. But I will move it on after 7 minutes to the next member so that everybody gets in. But generally we find it quite conducive to good debate. And if there is an organisation or group that hasn't been asked a question, sometimes I just invite that organisation then to come in if they haven't maybe spoken as the debate goes on. Now, hopefully that is all clear, and I'm going to now go through our organisations. And Mr. Minish of Crainn, I'm going to start with you to make your opening statement. And you have 3 minutes. We have a little ticker in the corner, so we'll just keep an eye on that. But over to you, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Hello. We would like to thank the committee for the invitation to submit as a witness on the topic of drug decriminalisation. We at Crainn have been working as advocates for policy reform, harm reduction and the safe regulation of cannabis for almost a year now through various online outlets. We have run a number of campaigns both online and in person and work hard to make the case for drug policy reform to the public and legislators. Irish drug policy has failed both society and the vulnerable people it was supposed to protect. For many years, our drug death rates have been amongst the highest in Europe, 3 times the EU average. Hundreds of people in Ireland die every year due to our current approach to drug policy. Addiction and substance abuse are health issues, not criminal ones. Current policy is outdated and clearly does not recognise this fact. A functioning drug policy is one that works towards reducing the harms of drugs. This is possible. It has been done before. Ireland has much to learn from jurisdictions such as Portugal, Switzerland, Malta, Vancouver, and many more. But we shouldn't copy and paste one programme and expect it to work here. We must come up with our own plan, inspired and influenced by other policies and the latest data. In our submission to the committee, we've outlined a number of recommendations, taking into consideration what has worked from other areas, what hasn't worked from other areas, and what we're hearing from both those who consume drugs and the support services. We propose that Ireland needs a clear, cohesive, multi-year plan that outlines exactly how we're going to reduce drug-related harms. We need to know where we're going to allocate funds, not only into services, but into education as well. Relevant ministers should show steadfast dedication in diverting the direction of drug policy, not least by meeting with foreign partners, but by actually putting together a working policy and evolving this policy to ensure that it meets current needs. Our future drug policy should also be centralised around a set of core pillars, similar to what is being done in Vancouver and what has been done in Switzerland. Harm reduction must be central to these pillars. We also propose a rethinking of how we treat cannabis possession in Ireland. Not only does personal possession of this drug take up the majority of drug-related court cases, costing the state massive amounts of funds and ruining future opportunities for many people, we have also seen alarming trends in counterfeit cannabis that has extreme adverse health impacts. Regulation here is absolutely necessary. We need engagement across the country, targeting areas that are hit by addiction while being flexible enough to adapt to emerging drug trends. We see services such as mobile overdose prevention clinics in Portugal that can access areas in which infrastructure is not yet established. Such pragmatic solutions like this in Ireland are necessary. Without a coherent, compassionate and health-led plan involving all stakeholders, Ireland will fail to make any progress in tackling drug-related harms to society and to users. We acknowledge in our submission the different kinds of drug use and how policy should approach them. We can tackle the alarmingly high rates of addiction in this country. It has been done elsewhere. We cannot do it without a plan. Our submission to this committee gives a number of overviews and analysis of Ireland and the wider world, offers some concrete solutions and raises issues that are often not covered by the mainstream eye. We hope that the committee considers what we have contributed with due care and we will continue to engage with the stakeholders on the ground in Ireland and across the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Minish. Okay, so now we take our second organisation to make an opening statement. And Dr. Garrett McGovern from the Priority Medical Clinic Dundrum is up next. So again, Dr. McGovern, you have 3 minutes to make your opening remarks.
I'd like to thank the Joint Committee for giving me the opportunity to give my thoughts on this very important issue. I've worked as a doctor in the addiction treatment area for almost 25 years. In many ways, I started in at the deep end treating heroin addiction. This was at a time when the methadone treatment protocol was implemented, which helped people address their addiction. What struck me in those days was that almost all the people that I encountered in those, at that time were in the criminal justice system for possession of drugs charges, many of them over many years. I'd be lying if I said, looking back to those early naive days as a doctor cutting his teeth in an area where there was little or no training, that I thought anything of this at the time. I didn't, I just accepted it. People committed the crime, people did the time. As the years progressed and I became more experienced and I picked up qualifications through training, it began to dawn on me that here I was treating a recognised illness, drug addiction, and yet the patients I was treating had to break the law to keep that addiction going. Thankfully, opioid substitution treatment with a stellar international evidence base of effectiveness is able to treat the problem and remove opiate withdrawal symptoms and cravings, so the need to use large amounts of heroin is significantly reduced. Without treatment, the problem is usually overwhelming and causes huge harm to sufferers, their families and their communities. Why in those circumstances do we criminalise the very same people for showing symptoms of their disease? In the course of my work, I also encounter people who don't have an addiction at all as such, but many have been referred to me as part of a court order to seek help for possession of usually small amounts of cannabis or cocaine or sometimes other drugs. They are irregular users, but because of the illegality of the drugs they use, they find themselves facing conviction and a criminal record for an endeavour that would seem no more abnormal than going out to have a few drinks with their friends. The implications of a criminal conviction can be severe. Stigma, shame, potential restriction on travelling abroad are very real concerns. To put one person through the criminal justice system for simple possession is costly in human and financial terms, and yet the international evidence base shows that it has little or no effect on the likelihood of that person using drugs again. I believe we need a fresh approach to this problem, and one that is rooted in evidence rather than moral ideology. We know from the experiences in Portugal, where in 2001 drugs were decriminalised and a health-led system replaced a punitive one, that the country reversed their trends in terms of drug overdose and HIV transmission prevalence. Presenting for treatment for addiction problem was no longer stigmatising. It was normal. Whilst Ireland has no plans to currently regulate illicit drugs, it is worth noting that countries that have regulated, for example, cannabis, the sky has not fallen in. In Ireland, people who use cannabis, many now for medical as well as recreational reasons, are criminalised for possession for personal use. Many have had to go abroad to be able to access cannabis for chronic medical conditions. This is inhumane and just plain wrong. You will doubtless hear in the course of the statements today about how harmful cannabis is and that the drug causes psychosis and other mental health problems, and that people who use it should be prosecuted and criminalised because that would be better for them. I treat cannabis problems, and whilst the majority of cannabis users use the drug without much problems, there is a significant minority that develop consequences of addiction, including mental health problems. You have to remember that these problems are occurring in a paradigm of prohibition and criminalisation, so none of these problems can be blamed on a legalised, regulated system. We don't have one in Ireland. Whatever the views people may have on legalising cannabis, there is no justification for criminalising people who use the drug. I urge the Joint Committee not to be swayed by arguments that criminalising people is good for them because it acts as a deterrent for further use. There's no evidence internationally that this is the case. As Abraham Lincoln once said, prohibition goes beyond the bounds of reason in that it attempts to control a man's appetite by legislation and makes a crime out of things that are not crimes. A prohibition law strikes a blow at the very principles upon which our government was founded. Many years later, another US President, Jimmy Carter, remarked, and this is particularly relevant to today's debate, that penalties against possession of a drug should not be more damaging to the individual than the use of the drug itself. I'd like to thank the committee for giving me the opportunity to speak today.
Thank you very much, Dr. McGovern. That was very interesting. Okay. Then next up we have Professor Smyth from the Cannabis Risk Alliance. Professor, likewise, you have 3 minutes to make your opening remarks.
Thank you very much. And thanks for the opportunity, Chair and committee members, to talk to you this afternoon. The Cannabis Risk Alliance constitutes an informal group of doctors from a wide range of specialties who are concerned about the substantial increases in cannabis-related harms evident in Ireland over the past decade. We have no funding and no employees. I'm a child and adolescent psychiatrist working in this area, and my colleague Dr. Hugh Gallagher is a GP specialising in addiction medicine. As doctors, we strongly support a health-led approach to cannabis and wider drug policy. Laws and sanctions are utilised across many areas of public health to nudge the behaviour of citizens away from risky behaviours and towards healthier behaviours. We recognise that the criminal justice system often plays a role in achievement of positive outcomes in areas of public health, including efforts to curtail mortality and injury related to road traffic collisions, and most recently, of course, during the COVID-19 pandemic. In our view, criminal justice and health are not opponents. Consequently, there's no inherent contradiction in criminal justice input into our current health-led drug policy. There is evidence from both Irish and international research that young people factor the risks of criminal justice sanctions into their decisions regarding drug use. In a recent Irish study of third-level students published this year, almost half of those who reported abstinence cited concerns regarding criminal sanctions as one of the many reasons behind their personal decision not to use drugs. The public health risk arising from a reduction in sanctions is that we reduce the deterrent effect provided by the current system. We believe that there is a real risk that a reduction in sanctions could cause use and associated health harms to escalate. The weight of evidence from national and international research indicates that sanctions have a small but important effect. Please bear in mind that small effects across large populations are clinically important. The Department of Health Working Group on this topic have recommended in their 2019 report that there should be a tiered response to people found in possession of drugs by An Garda Síochána, commencing with a health referral. When this topic is discussed in any form, Portugal is usually brought up for mention as a model. However, Portuguese drug policies are generally poorly understood. Contrary to what most people believe, drug use is still prohibited in Portugal. In 2001, Portugal moved to use administrative responses when people are found in possession of drugs for personal use. What gets ignored is the profound changes that they made to their addiction treatment system in the 2 to 3 years prior to that, where they moved from a treatment model which demanded abstinence to one focused on harm reduction and which sought to provide wraparound social supports to people in addiction treatment. Across this range of policy changes, which included the modification of the treatment model, there were improvements in a number of measures of alcohol or drug-related harm. However, not all trends have been good in Portugal. Adolescent cannabis use has approximately doubled. Portugal now has the second highest prevalence of daily cannabis use among adults in Europe, according to a recent report. Rates of psychiatric admissions due to psychosis associated with cannabis increased almost 30-fold, and rates of treatment entry for cannabis dependents compare unfavourably with those here in Ireland. When drug policy is discussed in Ireland, we tend to completely overlook our own successes. Like Portugal and most of Europe, we altered our treatment response in the mid to late 1990s. This yielded a 95% decline in adolescent heroin addiction and huge falls in cases of HIV and hepatitis C among people who inject drugs, and those falls are of the order of 75 to 90% over the last 20 years. My own adolescent addiction service, we actually shut down our specialist heroin treatment service 4 years ago as it was no longer needed. These notable achievements have occurred without any significant legislative change. In summary, as doctors concerned about drug-related harm, which includes harm to others, of course, we recognise that the criminal justice can have a role in deterring drug use, and we see it frequently used in other areas of public health. There is a significant risk in reducing this deterrent effect. In the absence, however, of any concrete, specific proposed alternative, it's difficult to give a firm opinion as to whether we should move to an alternative regime of administrative sanctions. A lesser sanction, which is more consistently forced, could, in theory, have a similar deterrent effect. With regard to sanctions available to courts, we view the option of imprisonment for personal use to be excessive and unreasonable. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor. Okay, so next up then we have Mr. Condon from the Patients for Safe Access. And again, Mr. Condon, you have 3 minutes to introduce your views to the committee.
Well, thanks very much for the committee for giving us the opportunity to speak here today and as witnesses on this very important topic. I'm here today as one of the directors of the Patients for Safe Access, and we're a group made up of patients and cannabis experts, and we're dedicated to ensuring safe and legal access to cannabis for therapeutic use, research, protecting the rights of medical cannabis patients, and to ensure patients and medical professionals have access to up-to-date scientific evidence. I'm also here as an epilepsy patient who has no other choice but to rely on the black market to access cannabis to treat my condition. This is solely due to an overly restrictive MCAP, Medicinal Cannabis Access Programme, leaving me with no option in treating my condition. Due to this, I'm labelled a criminal in our society and in our justice system. I have a number of criminal convictions for my continued use of cannabis, and as a result, I was denied a travel visa to travel to the US, where I would have had the opportunity to represent the Cork Institute of Technology as part of the Students for Sensible Drug Policy Society. While there, I was to take part in the 2016 United Nations General Assembly Special Session on drugs, which was taking place in New York City. I was robbed of this opportunity to learn and grow as a campaigner, to network with world leaders on the issues of drug use. I wish I could say that this was the worst thing that happened to me as a result of cannabis prohibition, but it's not. I was unfortunate enough to get an all-expenses-paid stay at the 5-star Cork prison at a time when prisoners still had to relieve themselves in a pot in the cell, and they would then have to empty that pot themselves the next morning when the cell door was open. I also had to lie to my daughter about where I was. My daughter then at the time was only 5 years old. I lied to her because at the time she knew prison as a place for bad people. When cannabis was made illegal in Ireland, it was done so with good intentions, much like the good intentions of those who also made condoms illegal and prohibited same-sex relationships. A lot has changed since then. Condoms are now available throughout society, and same-sex relationships are no longer prohibited. We now see that these prohibitions were wrong. They caused much more harm in society and needlessly created criminals out of people who otherwise would have never committed a crime. They say one of the reasons cannabis is illegal is due to its effect on a person's mental health. So with that in mind, I asked the committee to consider what effect taking a father away from his young family is going to have, not only on that individual, but on the family and the friends of that individual also. And I also ask if those harms outweigh the harms of cannabis and the harms of carrying a criminal conviction and incarceration too. When brought before the courts, I could never apologise for my use of cannabis because my use of cannabis was beneficial to me. I hoped by speaking for myself in court while representing myself for personal possession of cannabis, the judge would see I was not a criminal, but sadly that was not to be the case. I wish this was an isolated incident, but sadly it was not. We've seen many cases in Ireland where patients have been criminalised for self-medicating with cannabis. In one case from West Cork, a chronic pain patient was criminalised for €4 worth of cannabis. This man had his name and address printed in the media, adding more undue stress to his life, which does not just impact his life, but the lives of his family and friends. We've had patients feared of being criminalised who could not go without access to cannabis, have to treat their condition, forced to pack their bags and leave our shores to go to Ireland. I list a number of patients here, but to shorten my speech as I'm aware I'm out of time, Alicia Maher, who's also another director of the Patients for Safe Access, she suffers with long-term chronic pain, and as a result of the complications from series of surgeries she had back when she was a teenager. Alicia said cannabis has helped when other pain medications were failing. She had to pack her bags and leave our shores, and as a result is another of Ireland's medical cannabis refugees. Alicia left Ireland in November 2019 and moved to Alicante, Spain. She received a ministerial licence in 2020, but as the medicine would not be reimbursed under a medicinal cannabis access programme, she had to stay in Spain. Also, the availability of products under the MCAP was not sufficient to treat her condition. There's no reason to criminalise people using or growing cannabis to treat their conditions, and there's certainly no reason to be preventing access to cannabis for research and medical use. Cannabis needs to be removed from the Misuse of Drugs Act and regulated in a similar way to alcohol and tobacco. Patients who need cannabis for health issues should be given access to cannabis in a safe, quality assured way, in the same way in which they have access to other prescribed medicines. And I'll finish with a quote from our now Health Minister, Stephen Donnelly: "If a grown adult wants to grow a herb and then smoke it, there should be no negative consequences for other people, and they should be allowed to do that." So thanks again to the committee for hearing us on this very important issue, and we hope our contributions here today will help in some way to further break down the barriers preventing access to cannabis as a medicine and the needless criminalisation of people in Ireland.
Great, Agus Graham, good indeed. Thank you. Now, last but not least, we have Dr. Nuno Capaz, Director of the Portuguese Dissuasion Commission. Dr. Capaz, you're very welcome to the committee. Thanks for joining us today. And again, you have 3 minutes to make your opening remarks.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to address the committee. My name is Nuno Capaz. I'm a sociologist and I work at the Dissuasion Commission of Lisboa. The Dissuasion Commissions are the administrative authorities that were created in 2001 to deal with the procedures regarding the possession of illicit substance for personal usage. In 2001, Portugal decriminalized the possession of illicit substance for personal usage as part of a very comprehensive change in our drug policy. The basic goal was to deal with drug-related issues as a healthcare problem and steer away from the criminal and judicial system. The drug policy change was based on the four-pillar approach, and the Dissuasion Commissions were the law enforcement pillar. Decriminalizing drug usage for us meant we downgraded the possession of up to 10 days use from a criminal offense to an administrative offense. In our legal framework nowadays, being caught with a small amount of any illicit substance is very similar to being caught driving without the seatbelt or talking on a mobile phone while driving. It's illegal, but it's not considered a criminal offense, and therefore there's no need to activate the criminal and judicial system. The dissuasion commissions were created under the Ministry of Health, and they work as a diversion scheme. When a drug user is caught in the possession of illicit substances for personal usage, he is notified to present himself in a structure under the Ministry of Health that, after conducting a risk assessment screening, will determine if there will be any administrative sanctions applied or if there will be made any sort of suggestion of referral.
Thank you, Doctor. You're the first to come in under your time, so thank you for that. But indeed, you'll have plenty of opportunities to engage as the meeting goes on. Now, what we do next is we go around the table, so we'll take members of the committee with questions and points to share. The first one in, Senator Barry Ward, then Senator Linnerwan, and then we'll go around the table in further rounds. But Senator Ward, you're up first, and 7 minutes for your interactions.
Yeah, thanks very much, Chair. Can I say firstly that I'm actually very sympathetic to a lot of what has been said here today. As somebody who works in the criminal justice system as a primarily a criminal defence barrister, I come across people in different categories in relation to drugs offences, and obviously we're talking about people in a particular category of that possession for personal use. I am extremely alive to what has been said about the criminalisation of individuals who make a personal choice, be it for their own personal enjoyment or the reasons that have been outlined by patients for safe access either. And I understand entirely what's being said in that regard. We are losing the war on drugs, and not only that, but it has become a war of attrition. If you think about the amount of money that we spend fighting the kinds of cases you're talking about, and what could be done with that money, even if it never left the criminal justice system, it was reinvested in Garda Síochána, if it was particularly reinvested in diversion programmes or programmes to deal with crime in other areas other than drugs, I think we would do a huge service to the country. That said, it's not that simple, and one of the major problems that I have with this policy, or a policy that blanketly decriminalises either cannabis or a larger kind of spectrum of drugs, is that at the moment at least they are bound up with criminal organisations, and there is an inextricable link between organised crime that is providing the drugs and the drugs themselves. So it is not the case that when a patient, for legitimate reasons, decides to obtain drugs, that there are not victims as a result of that. That's the difficulty I have. Now, other people will make the argument about the slippery slope and all the rest, but even leaving that aside for 1 second, can I ask any of the witnesses if they can tell us how the logistics of this work? So, for example, let's say in the morning we say it's okay to use cannabis for personal use. I see your reactions. I'm wondering specifically, who provides it thereafter? Who profits from that? Yes, we put in place a regulatory regime. I have no difficulty with that. But who provides it? Who profits? And more importantly, what do we do to prevent a situation where this country becomes a de facto source for international trafficking of drugs?
Thank you, Senator. And do you want to put that to any particular
Well,
witness?
Mr. Condon seemed anxious to answer it.
Yeah.
I've just take the money out of it. Malta have a very good model over there where they allow a cooperative type model set up where the local community can come together, grow the cannabis for the people in the community who need the cannabis there. That way it takes the money out of it. Then the organised crime groups, there's going to be very little market left over once patients such as myself don't no longer have to rely on them.
And would you have it only available to patients, or would you have it widely available through that model?
I would think that model, looking at a wider, would be certainly the way forward. That's what started in California initially.
Yeah.
They had care collectives where caregivers would grow for patients, but they also would grow for others who weren't strictly medical patients.
That gives rise to the other difficulty, because I don't think anybody's suggesting that cannabis or any other drugs are good for people, but more so that the consequences of its use are worse for them than the damage the drug does to society or the individuals involved. Do we really want to promote a situation where the state is sponsoring the distribution of a substance that we know is not good for people, to people. And I'm sure any of you could give me a list of other products that are falling. I mean, alcohol is the obvious example, but other products that, even sugar products. But do we really want a situation where the state is facilitating the distribution of a product that we know is potentially harmful?
I think the state is just to regulate it, keep it safe for the individual, that they don't really have to get involved in it per se, just as regulators. And again, as I said, community type of collectives, take the money out of it and the criminals will go away as well.
Do any of the other witnesses agree with that? Or?
I think it's two separate pieces, really. I mean, this debate today is about just decriminalising the person. We're not talking about legalisation. I would be in favour of looking at regulation of all drugs. It's not going to happen in my lifetime, I don't think. I think it will happen at some stage. When, I don't know. I take your point, but I don't think that there's a suggestion from what you're saying that in order to have one, we have to have the other. And I don't think that's the case. I mean, there were something like almost 16,000 convictions for drugs last year, for 69% of the total number, and that was just for personal possession. So it's 69% of the total number of drug charges, and that's distribution and selling drugs. For what? It does not stop those people who are in possession of those drugs using drugs. There's no evidence anywhere that having criminal sanctions stops them using drugs or reduces the prevalence. So I think we do need to kind of separate out the two issues. They are related, of course they are. But I think there is just in 2022 no grounds whatsoever to criminalise people who use drugs for their own personal enjoyment, or indeed who develop problems. That's arguably even worse.
Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree that they're two separate issues, but as you say, they're related, because if you say, okay, we're going to decriminalise personal use of cannabis, for example, as I say, the reality is that people who are personally using cannabis are obtaining that from people who are growing it in contravention of the law, who are outside the law, who are invariably, not exclusively, but predominantly involved in illegal, organised criminal activity. And the danger, this is the one difficulty I have with it is, are you not therefore creating a market for criminal gangs to sell their product? Is that not an unintended or an unfortunate consequence of the policy of decriminalisation?
Personally, I don't think so. I don't think it has any impact on the prevalence of those people using drugs. Whether it's illegal or legal and regulated, people are going to still use those drugs. And I know today it's been dominated a little bit by cannabis, so we can't forget other drugs in this. I mean, and there's a whole, drug problems and drug use is not just down to regulation. There's a whole sort of cultural, socio, kind of economical aspect to this, and that includes, social marginalisation, deprivation. It's a complicated issue. I don't think for 1 minute that this issue here, if it was granted tomorrow, would solve all our problems. But I think, it would go some way to showing that we're serious about a health-led approach to drug use.
Thank you, Doctor. I'm just going to bring in Mr. Minish, because he has his hand up to reply to this, and then we'll move on to the next member. So, Mr. Minish.
Yeah, I just wanted to reply to the Senator there. The suggestion we've made around cannabis is that small-scale personal production of plant-based drugs should be tolerated. And in a decriminalised world, perhaps the model, if we're not moving towards a legal regulated market, is to allow the establishment of social clubs like what has happened in Spain. And whilst there is some criminality hanging around in that, the state should be most concerned with the most violent and organised crime. And we have to realise that we've actually handed this entire market, we've created this by keeping these substances illegal. So it will take time to replace it with something else. But right now, punishing the users is the wrong way to go after organised crime. And we should be working top down, not bottom up. And, at the moment, an awful lot of our cases are simple possession cases, and this is a travesty. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Minish, did you use the phrase plant-based drugs a minute ago? Is that what you said? Yeah.
Yes, I did. In our submission, we use the word plant-based drugs because this is about decriminalising personal possession of drugs, and there are other plant-based drugs that people are consuming. We want, where possible, people to come out of the black market because the black market is causing a great deal of harm to society, more so in many cases than the substances themselves.
Just so we're all on the same page, how do you define plant-based drugs? What's the definition?
Well, I don't know if there's a clear definition, but, mushrooms are used quite a lot by people, recreationally and therapeutically. Some people would use opiates and might wish to grow poppies and make tea? I don't know. I mean, my point is, if something is derived from a plant, it seems at odds slightly to keep it illegal when we're allowing the personal possession. We're not dealing with the source. What we want to try and do is connect people with the source without the criminal element. So if people can produce for themselves, either
Sure,
individually or as collectives, then it
that's-
allows them to step out of the wider criminality that is taking over all of the markets.
And that's what I'm just trying to
across
drill into, because I thought that might be intuitively what you meant. So I can see how cannabis herb is plant-based, I can see how mushrooms are plant-based, opiates are plant-based, but they get, I suppose there's a processing added to them. So would you draw a line in terms of that distinction, or are you talking about sort of things that can be sourced relatively pure, as opposed to things that have a chemical or a further process added to them?
I think that's not our area of expertise, but I think it needs to be looked at and considered. I mean, you know, historically people would have boiled up poppy heads to produce, you know, weak opium teas and these things, and these might be less harmful forms of the substances actually than injectable forms, and might help people find some middle ground. Again, our area of expertise here is cannabis, and this is what we spend most of our time looking at.
And with things like peyote and mescaline that Native American Indians use, and all sorts of different native substances.
Yeah,
Okay.
I mean, alcohol itself is plant-based as well. Let's consider it's derived from grains, and you know, we regulate that, and that helps contain some of the harms.
Sure. Thank you. So I'm going to move on now to the next round. So the next member in is Senator Rowan, and as with the last round, Senator Rowan will have 7 minutes, and that includes questions and answers. So, Senator, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. I think, first of all, thanks everyone for the contributions today. And although I agree with most of them, I think obviously we're definitely on different sides of this debate. We have been for a long time. But I do want to recognise your contribution, and that I suppose you are in a minority today in terms of that contribution. So I'll try to be kind. Obviously, for me, I think I don't misunderstand in any shape or form the Portuguese model and many of the other models, and I suppose I do have some concerns about some of the submission here, and I think rather than use up my time, go word by word through it, I think it might be actually more beneficial for me to actually engage directly with you at another stage in terms of maybe how particular pieces of research that I feel are not in context in terms of how I'd understand the research or read the research and things like that. But I think it's definitely probably too pedantic for me to do in this session today. So like say just for one example, just to give an example of what I'm talking about, when we talk about when drug policy is discussed in Ireland, we tend to completely overlook our own successes. And then we talk about like the opioids and the reduction in heroin use. I definitely think that that's not because of legislation. Obviously it's also wrapped up in drug trends and how drug use evolves and changes and how different drugs come on the market and things become much more prevalent. So I don't think there's a relationship in any sense or form between the two. But the people of the late 80s and 90s who are my friends and my communities, many of them are dead. So I mean the successes of heroin use change. We've lots of dead people, we've lots of people in prison, we've lots of people who are sitting at home at the age of 40, 50 and 60 and can't engage in employment. So it's not a success, I think, of Ireland, because those people are still there, and I don't think we have enough information on terms of it's been a success in terms of them not being hindered by the convictions that they would have taken, I suppose, while they were drug users. Do you know what I mean? So I just think there's some of that stuff that probably needs to be teased out, as they're not really related to prohibition in any sense or form working in this regard, or harm reduction fully working in this regard. But I think there's just some kind of references like that I'm uncomfortable with. I don't know if we'd frame them as successes, that there's a reduction in heroin, you know, because the people's lives that were in that are still very much struggling, I suppose. But I think for my question, I think we need to as well be careful on the committee, is because there's 3 conversations going at the minute, and I'm sure it's quite confusing. So we do have obviously the idea of medicinal cannabis, we have the idea of legalisation, we have the idea of decriminalisation, and then we also have another conversation which I think we all agree on, is that sometimes problematic drug use is harmful, and we agree on that. I was a problematic drug user myself. I would frame myself as a drug user now, not a problem drug user, and I've developed drug services, and now I work on in the legislative framework, right? So I've kind of had many journeys through this discussion. So I'm very aware that there's 3 or 4 conversations happening right now that are probably a bit confusing So it might need that we might need to have further committees on this to actually separate those conversations out, because I don't think anyone disagrees that we need to have people working with problem drug use. We just don't feel like they need to be in a courthouse or in prison. But I think if I just go to Nuno, I suppose, I don't know whether it's a language thing, but when we talk about diversion, people seem to be a lot more open, but it's when we mention decriminalisation, there seems to be maybe somebody feels like people feel like somebody's getting off of something, or the justice system is going to disappear for this. Is there a difference between a dissuasion service and decriminalisation, or are they effectively the same thing?
Well, in our case, yes, they're the same thing. The dissuasion commissions were the administrative authorities that we created, because it's still illegal to have any sort of illicit substance in your possession in Portugal. And therefore there are consequences. There is a procedure that is open when the police officer apprehends a substance from someone. The difference is that it's not a criminal procedure, it's an administrative offence one. And so people are referred to the dissuasion commissions, and that's in that sense that I mentioned the diversion scheme, because instead of sending people to court, we are sending them to a structure under the Ministry of Health.
Brilliant. So then to clarify, so say in Professor Smyth's contribution, it says that drug use is still prohibited in Portugal. And I can be corrected on my understanding here, and maybe Professor Smyth is right, but drugs possession is not prohibited, but the substance is prohibited. And isn't that the differentiation between the two? So the substance is prohibited and the substance is still illegal, but the possession of it for personal use is not, which means that drug use falls into not, once it falls into the prescribed amount of 10 days.
The possession is also forbidden. It's just not criminalized.
Yeah.
You are not going to have any criminal sanctions applied to you if it's possession for personal usage, but there are sanctions.
Yeah.
The list of sanctions is exactly the same as the driving offences.
Great, thank you. And then in relation to, obviously Portugal have had their model now for 20 years. Could you maybe speak a little bit to how you would see that, if now you were to revisit 20 years on in terms of what you have or haven't done or what you could do better, would you have, I suppose, any updated references to how you would do decriminalisation now, or if you were kind of re-looking at it, what would you do? Because obviously 20 years is a long time for the framework to be in place.
Well, I think the main difference would be the treatment that we gave cannabis. We enlisted cannabis in the list of all the other illicit substances, because back then the only condition that the government put a group of experts that look into the drug policy change that we were going for was that we should be inside the UN conventions that we signed, and therefore there was no talk about regulating cannabis. I would say that 20 years afterwards, that argument would be slightly different. Moreover, because some countries just decided not to follow with the UN conventions, and it wasn't a big deal.
So you would decriminalise all substances as is, but regulate cannabis?
I'm not sure. I cannot answer that directly.
Yeah.
But I would say that the discussion would be slightly different around cannabis than it was back in the day.
And has the Portuguese model been effective in addressing problematic drug use?
Yes.
Yes. Thank you.
It didn't solve the problem, but it helped manage the problem. The question about the drug policy and criminalizing and not criminalizing is that criminalizing a substance is based on the principle that the problem is the substance.
Yes.
It's a chemical thing. And addiction is not a chemical thing. Just simple as that. So therefore, there's no point in criminalizing a chemical substance, because it will not stop people from using it.
Yes. Thank you. Very clear. Thank you.
Doctor, just you mentioned at the close that it's not a chemical thing, so it's a psychological thing. Is that what you would say in terms of addiction?
Not just a psychological thing also. It's a lot of factors. It's an economical thing. It's a social thing. It's a psychological thing. It's also a chemical thing. But it's not just because you criminalize a substance that it's going away. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here, and the prohibitionist system would be working for the last 100 years. And I guess we all agree that it isn't. That's why we are all sitting here discussing this.
Very good. Okay, thank you. That concludes Dr. Rand's, Senator Rand's round there for now. We move on then to, I think Deputy Daly had his hand up next. Is he still in the room? Yeah, sorry, there you are. Sorry. Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. I suppose, look, over the years, I've seen a lot of stigma in a lot of offences, but particularly in relation to cannabis. And I've seen people criminalised or even brought to court, and you don't necessarily even have to have a conviction, because if you're going to the States, the very fact that you, the question on the form used to always be, were you ever charged with an offence, rather than whether you ended up with a conviction or not. But it did lead to loss of opportunity, loss of immigration, loss of employment, and consequences that were far in excess of what, of a young man usually who was taking a substance and really doing no harm to anybody else apart from himself. And I did see then over the years that the adult caution system came in, and at the last minute or close to the last minute, the inclusion of possession of cannabis in particular was removed from that list, so that even a local Garda superintendent who felt that this is a once-off of a group of lads, and someone might have taken responsibility for some cannabis that was in between the seats in the car, and he might not have had any more responsibility than anybody else. But there was no discretion, even one local superintendent in a rural area, to say, let's not charge this person. So there's a lot of fundamental unfairness in that system. But at the same time, then you see people who are, say, taking cocaine in particular, and they are enriching the Kinahans by buying cocaine, and that has huge consequences if you're balancing up the common good of society in general. So I suppose I have a question for Nuno, which is in relation just to figure out how the system works over there. First of all, who decides whether it's possession or whether it's supply? What is that? Is the THC content, does that come into it? Because there has been concern over the last 20 years that the THC levels have risen, and they're, particularly in young men whose brains are still developing into their 20s physically, that there is more harm being done to, in effect, they're getting brain damage out of it. And just in relation to two gentlemen on the left-hand side, what proposals would you have in relation to, if small items were decriminalised, and the stuff coming into the market, on larger amounts, do you think that all drugs should be decriminalised, or at what level would you say, okay, over this amount becomes a criminal offence? So just two questions there.
Well, on the first part, we have a threshold chart that quantifies for every illicit substance what's considered for 10 days usage. We have a chart that quantifies for every substance what's a personal dosage, a personal dose, and then we multiply it by 10. And if you have more than that, it might be considered a criminal offense, so you're referred to a court of law. If you're below that limit, you will be sent to the Dissuasion Commission as an administrative offense. But the police officers also have to cross it with other indicators. If there is any surveillance material that is a trafficking situation, or if the substance is divided in individual doses, or if the person also has a lot of money, live money on their possession. And so basically the threshold chart determines where the police sends the paperwork to in the beginning, and then it's either the court or the Dissuasion Commission that determines, after talking with the person, that determines if it's a personal usage situation or a supply situation. And if it's a supply situation, it's also always a criminal offense, regardless of the amount of substance. If it's a supply situation, then the court can have in mind the active principle contained in the substance to determine more fine-tuning the individual doses of that substance, and then refer the procedure to us, even though it's a little bit more than 10 days usage. The threshold chart is basically just there to remove the discretionary power from the police officer on the street.
Okay.
It's exactly like the driving under the influence of alcohol. I'm 1 meter 94. If they ask me to walk a straight line, I will probably not be able to walk a straight line, even if I'm totally sober. My feet are too far away from my brain. If you're a gymnast, you can be completely drunk and you will not fail that straight line. And that's why they use a breathalyzer and no longer the straight line thing or the touching the nose is exercise and things like that.
Okay, thank you. And Dr. McGovern, yeah.
Sorry, you had a second question?
Witness now, or-
The other, I did have a question about the THC content. Does that come into it? But I think you've answered the question sufficiently in what you
Yeah,
said.
court can ask for a more detailed analysis of the cannabis that is apprehended to determine the THC level, and then to more fine-tune this, determine how much dosage would that be.
Okay, thank you.
But the police officer on the street, they do not have access to that sort of testing.
Of course, yeah.
Just answering on a patient's perspective, a patient should be able to get access to cannabis through their health professionals. When it comes to how much cannabis a patient should be allowed, then that should be decided between them and the doctor. Common practice is normally a patient would have about maybe a month's worth of their prescription on hand in order to do whatever it is that they need to get done within that month. But when we're talking about wider adult use of cannabis, I don't see why there needs to be arbitrary limits, because that's really what they are at the end of the day, is just an arbitrary limit. When it comes to things like alcohol and tobacco in society, if a person goes down to the shop, they can buy as much alcohol or tobacco as they like. But it's not until we see that there's an intention there that they're breaking a law in terms of illegally selling that afterwards, that they now become a target of the authorities. Cannabis should be treated more differently than that. Person should be allowed to have as much cannabis as they would like to have at home, as many cannabis plants as they would like to have at home, and the onus should be on the authorities to prove, and just simply having a huge amount isn't proof that they were going to sell it there afterwards and thus break a law afterwards in selling cannabis. When we talk about other drugs, you mentioned, I personally, I'm not speaking for patients with safe access, but I personally have no problem with the wider decriminalisation of all drugs. And again, arbitrary limits, they're only going to put pressure on people on the street. It's not going to do much to tackle the problem of drug dealing. Again, we need proper, safe supply of drugs to people who use drugs. And then the worry of drug dealers goes away, because if you can go and get safe access to your drug of choice through whatever regulated means that may be, you don't have to be supporting drug dealers then therefore afterwards. So again, there shouldn't be arbitrary limits as to the amount of possession. The focus should be on the point of supply and the safety of that supply of the drug as well.
Thank you, Deputy. Want to move on now to the next member, and Deputy Martin Kenny is next up. Just to give an indication to the members as to the running order, we're going to take Deputy Kenny in a moment, then the Deputy Costello, and then Deputy Junior Kenny. So that's and then we might do a second round as needed. Okay, so Deputy Martin Kenny, you're up now.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you very much to all the witnesses. Just a couple of small points, because some of the questions have already been asked that I had in my head. It seems to me that the old adage that we've always heard, about the war on drugs not working, is very true. And I think that war has generally been on the supply. We've always been trying to stop supply, find the people that are supplying it, find the dealers, cut them out, all of that. And it seems to me that we need to look more at the demand side as to why it is the society continues to have a demand for all of these substances and deal with that, which is more looking at it from a medical perspective, from an addiction perspective. And that's really, I think, what the general consensus is around the table. That said, the big anomaly always comes up is that, the person who has possession of drugs for their own use is also the same person who has possession of drugs for to supply. And that is an issue, and that crossover will of course happen, particularly when we have people out there who unfortunately have an addiction problem, and in order to be able to pay for that addiction problem are going to be selling drugs to others who have an addiction problem. And the question, I suppose, is what methodology is in place, particularly in Portugal, to deal with that particular issue? Is it where the supply of the drugs is
coming from a different source, which is not the illegal source, which is a source that is regulated and is in place and is provided for through some mechanism by the state or by the sanction of the state. And I just like to get clarity around that. Thank you.
No, we do not have any sort of safe supply of any illicit drugs. We just decriminalized the possession. We didn't mess in any way with the supply side of the chain. So if people want to use illicit drugs, they will still have to go to the black market. As to the usage supply situations, normally what happens is that it's very complicated to prove that in court because it's very tiny amounts of substance and very tiny amounts of money also. And therefore there are no proofs to be collected by the police officers. But what we also noticed from daily practice in Portugal is that normally those situations go away if we deal with the usage part. If you are able to get a user that is also supplying into a treatment program, he will automatically stop supplying because he will not be needing money to support his own supply. And so what happens is that because court knows he won't be able to convict the person, because basically the user supply, it's basically a friendship thing. It's basically someone that lives outside the big cities but has a car. And so he's able to drive to the main city and buy substance and take back to his hometown for a couple of friends. It's not really supply. It's basically the same thing as you buying a little bit of cannabis and share it with a couple of friends. Is that supply? It is. Theoretically, under the law, it is. You are handing out a substance to another person to usage, right? But you're not getting rich out of that, so it's not a dealing situation as we normally perceive it in court. But no, we do not have safe supply in Portugal.
Okay, so do you understand the dilemma that presents from the point of view of how to get this situation to work, that the state does not become an advocate for the illegal supply of drugs?
Well, I understand, but there's I think we should be talking, or if you bear in mind that we're talking about people that use drugs, not drugs by itself. Everyone is a dilemma. Everyone has different reasons. Everyone has different backgrounds. Everyone has different motivations to use a drug, although the drug might be the same. And I think the reason why this change in policy worked for us was because of that. Because we decided to change it from the criminal system and into the healthcare system. And naturally, what that makes is that the criminal system focuses on the substance, on the drug, and the healthcare system focus on the person and not on the substance. And therefore, we are able to apply the law differently to everyone. It's the small supply or the user supply. It's every case is the case. So there's not going to be a rule that will solve everyone's problems. And I think dealing with it as an healthcare issue allows us to at least assess the situation by itself and according to the person.
Thank you. That's useful. I suppose the other contributors as well, I'd like their view in respect of that particular issue, because as has been said, we have a lot of other drugs that we use in our society all the time. Tobacco has been mentioned. Alcohol is probably causes more harm in Irish society than most things because we have a huge issues with it. But we do regulate it. We do know the strength of what strength the bottle of whiskey is, what strength the can of beer is. We do know and there is a regulated system in place there which ensures that, if you like, people aren't going to be poisoned, which is although many would say that any of it is poison, but that sense of having a regulatory process in place. Is there a value in that? And I'd just like to see what people's views are in respect of that.
But Professor Smyth, yeah?
Yes, Brendan?
I suppose my response to that would be going back to alcohol. As you say, we regulate alcohol. We have the quantity of alcohol on the bottle. And you seem to be questioning maybe we should do the same for drugs because as though that system is working or associated with low rates of harm. Alcohol kills more people each year than all illegal drugs combined. when you look at the National Drug-Related Deaths Index and their drug poisoning data, the substance that tops that list in those deaths is alcohol. So that should remind us that simply by regulating and legalising access to a substance, you certainly don't eliminate harms. It suggests to me you don't even reduce them. You may actually increase them because you normalise the behaviour, you massively increase the pool of the population who use that substance, as is the case with alcohol. 80% of Irish adults use alcohol, whereas only 8% in any given year will use any of the illegal substances. So that suggests to me, you used the term war on drugs. I think that's an unfair characterisation of Ireland's drug policy over the last couple of decades. Certainly drug policy is now led by the Department of Health. To say that they're waging a war on drugs, I think is unfair. And it's a reference that people who support drug legalisation regularly use. It's a smear on European drug policy. And relates obviously to the policies adopted in the United States half a century ago, and not really relevant to the modern discourse, which is health-led.
Thank you, Professor. I'm going to David Kenny. That's your slot up, unfortunately. But just I know Mr. Minish wanted to get in before we move on to the next member. Did you want to make a brief comment, Mr. Minish?
Yeah, I did. I just wanted to comment on what Professor Smyth said there. The DUHEI study he cited in his own introduction there that showed some deterrent effect also showed that over half of our third-level students have used drugs, 37% within the last year. So I am actually I think the figure of 8% is an old figure, and this follows more of a European trend. And what we actually need to do is be regulating around the harms. I do think there needs to be safe supply, and I think we need to cross this bridge, particularly with some of the more addictive substances. It will be a difficult conversation, but we did have safe supply back in history when these compounds were supplied through pharmacies. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Minish. I'll just give you an opportunity to respond if you wish to.
When I say 8%, that's drawn from the general population survey, which includes the entire population age range. Obviously, the sector of the population most likely to report drug use in the past year are indeed young adults and older teenagers. So hence the figure in the third level survey that you quote is higher than the proportion.
You could ask every politician in this house if they've used drugs, and they will lie because of the stigma and because of prohibition. Them figures of people saying, so if we were to remove prohibition, you would see an increase because people won't feel like they need to lie because they feel like criminals.
Senator,
I can tell you half this house probably uses drugs. They're not going to say it.
Yeah, I think that's the point he's making, actually. The professor is saying that it is more likely that there will be self-declaration amongst the younger population than an older population.
No,
that's your point, I think, is it?
I'm saying there's more use amongst the younger population.
Okay, I'm going to move on to the next speaker, who, look, everybody, I see people shaking heads. That's part of the process here. We have a debate. People express their opinions. They're entitled to do so. Other people may have different opinions and are equally entitled to express them. Deputy Costello, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you. Picking up some of the themes from Deputy Kenny and Senator Ruan, there is a lot of different things here. They're all being mushed together, and a lot of separate conversations and separate streams here. And picking up on Deputy Kenny's point about demand reduction, yes, we had successes, perhaps partial successes, as Senator Ruan points out, in the mid to late 90s, but a lot of that was driven by the Rabbit report, by a concentrated effort to reduce demand for drugs. And, that involved a lot of investment into communities, into community development, into poverty, tackling poverty, the Combat Poverty Agency, all these sorts of things, which have since fallen away. And, they're incredibly important and things we should be doing. However, they are separate to the question of criminalisation. And the question of demand reduction is essential, and I'd love to hear what Portugal is doing on demand reduction, but we'll come back to that piece. So the question then is criminalisation causing more harm or is it causing a benefit? And, you know, one of the things I look at is the huge number of, compared to other European countries in relation to drug deaths we have in this country. We were a lot slower in rolling out naloxone in this country, partly because of the stigma and around illegality. You know, we've talked about some of the social impacts, the impacts of criminalisation on supply for medical use. So what I'd love to hear from Dr. McGovern and Professor Smyth is around the impact of criminalisation on things like naloxone, on access to treatment, the stigma of criminalisation impacting those kind of things. I would like to, as I say, hear something about what Portugal is doing in relation to demand reduction, and then just, you know, again, there is one of the questions here was from several people on the committee, and I'd echo again, because I think if we have some time at the end to give it a bit more to explore the alternative supply routes, because obviously we don't want to be supporting organised crime, but there are lots of alternative models. We heard about Malta. My understanding is Spain also is growing collectives. Switzerland allows personal growing. Any other, just, I'd love to give some space to hearing those other alternative supply routes that take the criminal out of it and, you know, might introduce a healthy amount of VAT into the state coffers. So I'll start with Professor McGovern and Professor Smyth on the negative impacts of criminalisation in relation to access to treatment, naloxone, overdose, all those kind of things.
Well, thanks for giving me the opportunity to respond. I mean, first of all, the stigma associated with heroin use is a far greater stigma than any other drug I can think of. Slowly been matched now by crack cocaine, probably, not so much powder cocaine. And those people, I work with those people every day, as I know Lynn does too. And a lot of those people were afraid to come for treatment back in the day. We didn't have opiate substitution treatment services. We haven't had naloxone until recently. But when you're talking about stigma, some commentators have called it a form of a drug apartheid, that some drugs are treated differently than others. I've never known a drug quite like heroin in terms of the way the people who use that drug are talked about by other people who know very little about the drug and very little about the communities they live in. So I've had people who, when I started working in the late 90s, wouldn't come to the clinic because it was in a neighbourhood that they lived in. They said to me, is there another way I can see you? I don't want to come through the front door. Many of the people that live close to me don't know I'm using that drug. And that's a horrible thing for somebody to come in who you're trying to help with a health problem, and yet they're shying away from treatment. And if you look at the statistics, I think it's climbing a bit, but there's probably maybe almost 12,000 people on opiate substitution treatment. There are probably a lot of people, and I have met them, who would not go to a treatment clinic because of the stigma associated with the labelling of that disease. And we know, and I won't mention them in this room, and we know what all that language is. So when we're talking about stigma relating to drug use, we're really talking about stigma related to specific drugs. And that drug is different than other drugs. As I say, crack cocaine is a very, very, I wouldn't say a developing problem, it's a problem in many marginalised communities now. And in terms of naloxone, we've been late to the table with naloxone. We could have a whole debate about naloxone and the way it should be wheeled out. I think we should be very low threshold in relation to naloxone. The idea that it's on prescription and that it's given by a doctor, I am against. I don't think there's any evidence whatsoever that naloxone is misused. I think we should be low threshold because it can save people's lives and it can save them immediately. Thank you.
I suppose your question, does criminalisation impact access to treatment? I would certainly fully agree actually with Dr. McGovern when he says that people who use heroin are viewed completely differently from a stigma perspective compared to users of other substances. And there's a clue in that in terms of the relationship between the illegal status of a drug and the stigma associated with it. All drugs are illegal, but people who use cannabis will have a very stigmatised attitude towards people who use heroin. There was research done by Professor Jamie Saris from Maynooth, where he interviewed people at all sort of levels within the drug use and supply network. And what he found was a remarkable degree of stigma held by drug dealers who were involved in clearly more an activity that's you'd imagine should carry more stigma within the general population. But their view of people who used heroin was phenomenally negative. So the stigma tends to be associated with the drug. That's not to do with its illegal status. It's to do with the degree of risk that other people see associated with that particular behaviour. There's huge stigma associated with alcohol dependence. Dr. McGovern talked about people being reluctant to access methadone treatment, within their neighbourhood. I mean, Dr. Gallagher might talk to the issues of alcohol treatment in adults, but people who are alcohol dependent are oftentimes reluctant to access treatment in their own area because there's a stigma associated with being addicted, to having an addiction. So to say stigma is as simple as being linked solely to just the illegal status of the drug is grossly simplistic. And just one last point. There's a sense that lots of people who use drugs are at very high risk of convictions. I still meet hundreds of young people who use drugs annually who access our service. Like, I honestly can't think of the last time I met a young person, under 18 anyway, because that's the main group I work with, who had a drug possession conviction. I remember years ago someone worried about it, but not in recent years. That the Gardaí do seem to have a lot of discretion, certainly under 18. At most, people get a JLO, but generally it's just a caution.
I think that's more to do with our response to youth offending in general, as opposed to I think yeah.
Wouldn't read significantly to that too much.
Okay. Thank you, Deputy Costello. Now, Deputy Gina Kenny, you're very welcome to the committee, and you have 7 minutes as well to put your questions and comments.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks very much, and thanks for everybody for coming today. This very worthwhile debate. I just want to kind of go back to the future, and that future was the mid-70s, 45 years ago, in relation to the present laws around the Misuse of Drugs Act. I think that's where we start. And obviously them laws are still prevalent today. And them laws were introduced to essentially do a number of things. Was to stop the proliferation of drugs, give people criminal sanction for possession or the sale of that material. In my opinion, it has done the opposite. It has enriched a certain amount of people in society. It has created a black market, i.e. kind of criminal gangs, and it has brought kind of chaos to certain communities in Ireland in relation to all that. So with all that, one would have to ask, is the present laws around drugs working? Are they working against people? And I would say they're working against people. We were in Mountjoy, myself, Lynn, and a few others. We were playing a football match in Mountjoy last week. It was a really kind of very educational experience. And I asked the governor, how many people in prison in Mountjoy are here for drug-related offences? And he said 80% and more. Now, come on, right? Come on. Right? So he's saying there's 80% of people are in prison for one form of another in relation to. So it's obvious. It's obvious the law doesn't work, right? It doesn't work. And anybody that says that the present laws around drugs work is part of the problem. It's part of the problem. So with that, we have to do something different. And I would argue that we need to do. We need to do something very, very different. And I think the HSE and the government have paid a lot of lip service in relation to a health-led approach, completely. I mean, obviously they're talking about the Citizens' Assembly next year, and that's welcome. But, this has been talked about for decades in relation to doing something different. And decriminalisation and even regulation is, it's not the silver bullet by any means. Drugs do terrible things to people, absolutely. Things they would never do. It does terrible things to communities. It does terrible things. But drugs are a reality whether they're illegal or not. So, in that kind of vein, I'm of the opinion that we need to do something completely radical, absolutely the opposite of what we have to do now. Because the more we kind of criminalise people, the more this kind of this situation kind of continues. So with that, a number of questions to Dr. Smyth. Is there any circumstances that you would see a model of regulation put in place rather than what we have at the moment? Is there any kind of circumstances that you would see as a medical doctor, as a citizen of this country, that this system doesn't work?
I suppose we currently do regulate sale, manufacture, distribution of a drug. It's called alcohol, right, as you know.
Yeah.
And as I've said already, it kills more people than all illegal drugs combined. And I think it does so not because it's intrinsically more harmful or dangerous than heroin or crack cocaine. It does so largely because its use is normalised, because there is regulated access to it. Now, we have faced challenges in terms of our alcohol policy. We are where we are with alcohol. And hence we had the Public Health Alcohol Bill a couple of years ago, and it's slowly been enacted, and that's small steps in the right direction, all of which increase restriction. I would be very, very loath to move any other substance into that category of regulated sale until I saw our current legal drug regulated more effectively and the harms linked to it massively reduced.
So what you're saying is that you're not open to regulation at all?
And there's nothing I've seen from the countries that have regulated that caused me
even
to
though
want to
even
go,
though
to go
we've
down
seen
that
in
path.
Portugal where the hard evidence is that it saves lives, because that's what it really comes down to.
See, again, I think that's a misrepresentation of what's happening in Portugal.
But in Portugal, it's fact, Dr. Smyth, it's fact.
It's a fact.
Thousands of people are alive today because the system that they put in Portugal. It's fact.
But
right? And you're denying that fact.
You're suggesting that the only thing they did in Portugal was change their drug laws, and that's not true. They fundamentally changed their approach to treatment as well.
Yes.
I don't think any of us are disagreeing with that as a
And you're
parallel measure.
You're suggesting that.
Let's just take from the questioner that has possession, which is Deputy Kenny.
Yeah. So are you not kind of the opinion that what's happened in Portugal has saved lives, has brought people out of the criminal justice system? You know, this system works. And even, like, from my opinion, decriminalisation goes so far. I would be of the opinion that you need to regulate, particularly cannabis. I think cannabis should be legalised and regulated. But the more people stigmatise and kind of put out this claptrap all the time, is that, you know, they say, look, okay, we have to accept the present laws around drugs. It's criminalising people. It doesn't work. So if it doesn't work, then we have to do something different.
You're saying we need to regulate drugs, and you're using Portugal as an example. Drug use is not permitted in Portugal.
Yeah, but we need to go beyond that, Ian. We need to go beyond that. But I'm starting from 2001. Do you accept in Portugal? Would you agree that in Portugal is a better system than we have in Ireland? Yes or no?
I think the data in Portugal is mixed, genuinely.
But it saves thousands of people's lives. It has. It's fact.
I think that the number of drug-related deaths as reported by Portugal have reduced.
Can I ask? Okay.
The number of patients admitted with psychosis linked to cannabis use has increased 30-fold.
Okay. Can I ask Dr. McGovern the same question?
I'd like to just make one point, and that is that Professor Smyth has said that alcohol policy in this country is dangerous. And whilst it's not, we haven't got alcohol policy quite right. There is no doubt that if alcohol was illegalised tomorrow, those harms would be exponential. So the idea that we, in a vacuum, look at the legalisation of alcohol and leave it at that, we need to compare it with what the alternative is. And that is what we are doing in relation to all the other drugs. And one of the things I would say is that every time somebody says legalisation doesn't work, We have no examples in this country of a legalised system of currently illicit drugs. So you have to ask the next question: what would you do to make the situation better if you're not going to regulate those drugs? That, I can only read from that you make them more prohibited. You make the sanctions greater. I'd like an answer to that, because I don't ever get an answer to that when that question is asked. We tend to only talk about legalisation. We have only known a paradigm of prohibition. In response to yours, there is no doubt by the most important metrics that the Portuguese model, whilst not perfect by any means, is far better. They're in a far better situation than they were in 2001. And yes, regulation or changing drug policy is only one factor. They increased the level of help and support people got, and the stigma reduced to seeking help was reduced. So when you look at increased numbers, you cannot look at those numbers in isolation. When stigma goes down, people admit things. And Lynn made that point earlier on, that people will lie, and they'll lie for a very good reason. So we can sit here today and continue to do what we're doing, but more and more people will come to harm and more people will die. That is a fact. It's irrefutable.
Thank you, Doctor. I'm going to go to the two more witnesses who have their hands up, Dr. Capaz and Mr. Minish. And I suppose Dr. McGovern just made the point, I know you're making it in a rhetorical sense, but we're not doing the same thing we've always done. That's why we're here today, literally, to have the meeting, to have the discussion, to see where can we go next, or where should we go next. Okay, Dr. Capaz, I'm going to take you in first.
Yes, I have
and
just
then
a small question for Dr. Smyth. He just mentioned earlier, quite anecdotal, that he doesn't know any youngster that works in his organization that was convicted for cannabis. I would like to know if he knows any youngster that was convicted for underage drinking.
We're not going to have we're actually out of time for this block, so we're not going to have a question and answer between witnesses. Sorry, so I'm not sure.
Quick yes or no answer, but that's okay.
Okay. Mr. Minish?
Yeah, I just wanted to take issue with the point that Professor Smyth raised. He said that there was a 30 times increase in cannabis-related psychosis in Portugal. Now, looking at the paper, because I do know this paper, I can see that there are issues with how the data has been gathered, because it's gathered on admission data, so it obviously relates to people feeling open. But if you take this paper at worst possible value and treat all the numbers with respect, it implies that about 5 in 100,000 cases of 100,000, about 5 in 100,000 cannabis users will develop psychosis, or 1 in 20,000. So in terms of deterrence, we've arrested for possession on average about 16,000 people a year. Now, assuming they all reform themselves and never use cannabis again, we're preventing less than 1 case of cannabis psychosis a year through our use of the justice system. It seems a very unfortunate way to use a justice system. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. That concludes that round of contributions from members. I'm going to invite members to come in a second time if they wish to. Before I do so, I'm going to take my own opportunity as a member of the committee to put in a few questions. We've touched on this subject already, but the thing that always comes to mind in this debate is there is a substance which many people, which is classified in some cases as a drug, which many people enjoy socially. Many people have it with friends, family, in licensed premises at home. A small minority abuse or struggle with and have it as a demon. That drug is, of course, alcohol. It also has greatly varying strengths. There are some very low strength beers in the market, right up to very strong spirits. And then when we move into perhaps the small, unregulated space, the likes of Puccino or whatever, or ooze or grappa, depending on what country you're in. Some of them are for sale legally, some of them are not. But we have different potencies. And I wonder it always strikes me, if that was to suddenly be introduced to the market now or in the last maybe half century, would it be in the same category as cannabis, for example, or would it be treated differently? And I suppose if that was to be introduced tomorrow and we didn't have all the laws around that we do, what could or should be done with it? I mean, would witnesses be saying we should actually be criminalising it and banning it, and people that have a bottle of Heineken in the back pocket should be sent to enjoy? Or would we be saying that actually they should be able to use it freely? Or what would we say? What could or should we do if that was the case? I don't know if any particular, Mr. Condon?
We already had an example of alcohol prohibition, not in Ireland, but in the US. And we seen then the problems that were created. It wasn't that somebody was going around with a bottle of Heineken in the back pocket. It was that people moved the harder substances in terms of whiskey and the spirits because the volume became a problem. And also obtaining beers, quality beers would have become a problem. But whiskey and stuff like that would have been easily available. So we seen the effects of alcohol prohibition. If alcohol was only invented tomorrow, well, we see the results that prohibition is going to bring to our society, which is such as the machine guns, the Tommy gun, the infamous Tommy gun, that became known, got its infamous nature because of alcohol prohibition. So again, we apply that then to other drugs. We see the Kinahans, they're another infamous name, so speaks for themselves.
Yeah, okay, very good, thank you. I don't know, does anyone else want to come in? Professor Smyth?
So what, your question is if alcohol was discovered tomorrow? I think in terms of the ranking of harms associated with drugs or substances and the risks, alcohol is probably somewhere in the middle of the ranking. So I don't think it would be the substance plucked out of the lot to be the one that we would choose to regulate in the first instance. But as I said earlier, we are where we are with alcohol. As Mr. Condon has sort of said, prohibition didn't work largely because of enforcement issues and compliance issues. That you can't put the genie back in the bottle. So I recognise prohibition is not an answer in terms of alcohol. We just need to regulate it better. But for me, that's an extra reason to worry about moving down the path of legalising other drugs. Because when things get worse following that, as I believe that they will, it'll be too late. You won't be able to put that genie back in the bottle either. And we'll then have two, or if not more, legal, addictive, intoxicating substances available and doing increased harm across the population.
Sure. And I wonder to what extent or is it an accident of history? Because I think at one stage opium dens were popular in polite society, and I think cocaine, according to Sherlock Holmes, was frequently used in Baker Street and other places, and perhaps some of them, and maybe there were economic reasons and trade and maybe even political reasons, that some were bad and some weren't. Mr. Minish, you have your hand up. Do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I just wanted to come in on alcohol, really. There has been a couple of studies in alcohol to rate the harms of alcohol alongside other substances, illicit and illicit. And the 2015 European Survey of Drug Harms found that alcohol was about twice as dangerous as any of the other substances. It ranks considerably more severe, both in its impacts to the users and to society, than even the opiates. So, to say it's in middle ranking is actually incorrect. Thank you.
Okay. Well, witnesses can feel free to agree to disagree on different points that are raised, but everyone's entitled to their opinion. The other question I'm going to ask, and it actually comes from something Mr. Minish said earlier, but I think it's an interesting observation potentially, and it's a plant-based substances. And I wonder, is there an argument for considering materials that maybe grow, organically in the ground, be that mushrooms as you suggested, or be it a herb, or be it weed, or whatever, as opposed to maybe something like perhaps cocaine or amphetamines, whatever, that are maybe chemically produced, or ecstasy or whatever that's produced in a lab, that perhaps has an extra degree of processing and an extra layer on top of that. And is there an argument to members, do witnesses have any view, is there an argument that perhaps one that is, I suppose, more naturally occurring, a fruit of the ground type thing, should perhaps have a greater support or regulatory tolerance, as opposed to one which is created for the purposes of influencing behaviours and chemical reactions? I don't know if any witnesses have any particular views on that. Please.
Given my background of an honours degree in herbal science and done a lot of research actually in traditional use of plant-based medicines as they might otherwise be known. And for example, cocaine, when it was used traditionally in places like Peru and high altitudes, it was very beneficial for the people, and the way in which they used it, it didn't impose the harms that we would associate now today with cocaine. That was primarily because they used it in its natural form. They weren't extracting it, they weren't concentrating it. That again is a product of prohibition that came a bit afterwards. Actually, no, it was a product actually of Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola came around, they were putting the cocaine, and that became a problem, and it got removed, and then prohibition came afterwards. The market came first, and then the prohibition came afterwards. But there's a person by the name of Darnell Larson. He's part of Drug Users Liberation Front in Vancouver, and he's actually got a coca leaf tea cafe And people who use cocaine, who might be seen as problematic users, cocaine, seen that as a stepping stone, as a way to reduce the harms that were associated with their overuse or their addiction to cocaine. They go down and they'll take some leaves, they might drink a tea, or a better way to use it, more traditional way, is to chew it and keep it in the gums. But the harms are drastically reduced then when you use it in that form, as opposed to the more concentrated forms.
Very good. Does anyone else want to offer an opinion on that? No? Okay, very good. Okay. I'm going to invite members then to come in on a second round if any members wish to. I don't know if any members wish to come in again. Yeah, okay. So there's a shorter block, 3 minutes for the second round.
Yeah.
Senator Wah? Yeah, you want to come in?
Yeah, the last, obviously, you know, many of us are a long time in this field, and I don't underestimate anyone's, I suppose, intention or how much people care about the people that they work with. And I think I'm getting more and more disheartened as this conversation goes on, because I'm obviously in this conversation not only in the Justice Committee now, but obviously it's something that I've worked towards for a long, long time. And I think what keeps happening is I'm becoming more and more, I suppose, scared for my community, really, in a sense, because there seems to be this intellectual conversations going back and forth, and the actual drug user, right, who's not responsible for a black market and a drug trade. And we talk about, there was comments, I suppose, from Deputy Kenny and Senator Ward around the state doesn't want to be seen to be facilitating a black market, but we facilitate our own pockets because of that black market, and the hypocrisy of that is absolutely unbelievable. The justice system, the legal aid system, probation, prison, all of these people are benefiting and profiting from prohibition. And it's like, but the people at the bottom of that are still suffering, are still going to prison, are still getting stopped on the street and searched, are still having to tell their child that they can't go with them on the summer project because they have to be guarded vetted to go, and they'd be too embarrassed to tell the local community centre that they've a charge from 20 years ago. So when we talk about saving lives, it's not only in the immediate, and it can't be seen as that simple, I think. And so in the long term, it can save lives because it can actually help lives flourish, not to have a conviction. So I think if we forget for a moment about what drugs, what market, who benefits, we just talk about who's losing here and how do we help them, while we figure out what the harm reduction model is, while we figure out what the drug policy is, while we figure out what the interventions are that people need. As humans, every society in the world pleasure seeks through substance use. There's the problem. How do we look at the human psyche and human development of the need to seek pleasure or the need to medicate, whether it's environmental or whether it's a human actual evolvement of our psyche, and what can we stop using poor people mostly as a weapon to have this conversation with? Because I think all of us can agree here that none of them are criminals. You know, Martin's not a criminal, Kenny's not a criminal, I'm not a criminal, my family aren't criminals, all the friends I buried who have overdosed in hostels because of poverty, because of their addiction, are not criminals. And I think we all agree with that. So why do we keep using them as a pawn in this other intellectual, medical, other conversation that's actually not serving them? And I think if we can actually begin to actually look at our own prejudice, our own bias, our own understanding of human development and why we pleasure seek and why we self-medicate, and look at poverty and look at marginalisation, and stop actually using the criminal courts to actually focus the attention on the people that actually need our support, everyone's support in this room. And I just think the focus is completely wrong, and they need to be separated out. That's
very good. Excellent. Thank you, Senator. Do any of the members present want to come in for a second? Oh, sorry, yeah.
I've been working in addiction service, similar to Garrett McGovern, for about 20 plus years as well. Started working in the addiction, in the HSE addiction service, started working in the prison service as well, in the training unit, in my joy, which was were a completely drug-free unit, which unfortunately no longer exists. I think it was a fantastic facility where people could, if they detoxed, they could enter and stay, they could go to work and so on and so forth. So that's a huge deficit, in my view, within the criminal justice system, that no longer exists, or such facilities and such services no longer exist. Within the addiction clinics, I used to write reports for court, maybe 2-3 a week, every week. Back then, my patients were dying back then, frequently. from HIV, from overdose, and so on and so forth. And they weren't living. A lot of them just simply were not living very long. That has changed dramatically in the meantime. I might write one medical report a year for court these days. So my patients aren't getting, to my knowledge, they're not being, and if they are going to court, and it's not that they're still not going to court and not going to prison, but generally it's for theft or other reasons that they're using in order to gain the money to buy the drugs, presumably, in the majority of cases. I suppose the system or the service that we offered was largely biological or medical initially, in terms of, but even within that, I mean, when I started in the service, first of all, you talk about stigma. I mean, when I was trained when I started working in addiction service, first of all, that if a person wasn't complying with their treatment, we actually were supposed to reduce their methadone dose. I mean, it was barbaric, it was inhumane, it was ridiculous. But that prevailed, unfortunately, in some circles, and did so for some time afterwards in certain services. But yeah, we've all obviously altered that. I would like to think that I've spearheaded increased choice in relation to treatments that are available for people with addiction, opiate addiction in particular. But in buprenorphine and injectable buprenorphine now becoming available, which is huge, which is recovery in injectable form essentially, and removes so much, so it provides so many benefits and reduces so much stigma of having to attend at clinics and so on. But and I suppose I worked in the voluntary sector as well and in the private sector, but within the voluntary sector, I suppose what I saw, particularly in those marginalised communities, was an increasing the real benefit, both in terms of presentations with drug problems and benefit from treatment, was in increasing the psychological, which we had been doing all the time, but very ineffective in a lot of cases, if not combined with social interventions. So to me, social interventions, both in terms of prevention and in terms of treatment, is really key to success. I mean, we can look at the Icelandic model, which I think is, what they've done down through in recent decades, and the benefits of their interventions in reducing drug use, reducing social problems. The success they've had in terms of increasing participation in sports and music and so on and so forth. So, I would suggest that what has happened in Portugal as well, we've prevented the deaths of vast numbers of people as well by the interventions that we have undertaken. But I do believe that social interventions. I work in an area in one particular part of town where in that particular street there's crack dealers in every corner. You can't escape it. It's very, very hard to escape it. But giving those people something to do, in any areas that you talk about, Lynn, as well. I mean, it's social interventions, both in terms of protection and in terms of assisting if they are in drug use, that I think are what's key to success, really.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Now, Deputy Costello wishes to get in for a second.
Just very briefly, yeah. Just like, again, focusing on demand reduction, why we use drugs can help. Better interventions, yes, can help. Like Subutex, I'm going to stick with the brand name, it's easier to pronounce. Subutex, when I was working in Merchants Quay 20 years ago, Subutex was widely used in the UK, and you're saying it's only coming in here now, so we seem to be quite far behind. So yes, better interventions are really important. But again, just like it's not a choice between demand reduction or improving interventions, it's not necessarily a choice between looking at the criminal aspects of it and better interventions. We can do the demand reduction, we can do the better interventions, and we can look at the criminal status of it all at the same time. And when criminalisation gets in the way, that's of the harm reduction, of the better interventions, that's where it becomes a problem. And as I say, the delay to roll out naloxone and things like that, I look at other services where testing of pills for quality and safety is not done in this country because of the issues of criminality around it. Safe injection rooms are on hold essentially because of the criminalisation. So here's the two harm reduction things that are being impacted by the criminalisation. The safe access for patients is being impacted by the criminalisation. So it's, again, these are all, in a way, silos, they're all separate. Yes, we should be doing better interventions. We should be doing the demand reduction. We should be providing the psychological supports, because it's not just a purely chemical reaction and all of that. But I still come back to the fact that, and this is where I was going with the question, you know, if the criminalisation, if the prohibition is getting in the way of the harm reduction and getting in the way of the better interventions, surely we need to be looking at that so that we can ultimately have both better interventions and the demand reduction, which goes back to, like, anyway, demand reduction we could talk about for hours and hours and hours in a thing and of itself, and it ties deeply into all the stuff Lynn was talking about in relation to poverty, to exclusion, to inequality, you know, and, you know, there's a whole host of things we could talk about simply looking at demand reductions. The better interventions, we could spend hours talking about that, but they're not mutually exclusive. And I think I'm just conscious that we are, you know, there's a lot of things being mixed up here.
I don't know if anyone wants to comment on that,
But I'm just kind of talking at this stage.
There's a suggestion that drug use is much more common in deprived communities, and certainly the evidence from national surveys doesn't bear that out. Again, the more recent general population survey indicates that the rates of drug use are pretty much evenly distributed across the entire economic domain. So that's certainly not the only driver, or even a massive driver actually, of drug use. We do need to, you know, and our drug laws are, at the end of the day, they're actually a very small, but I think important component of our wider drug policy, which needs to look at prevention, which means looking at the social, family, individual, school, community-based determinants of drug use, which is where Iceland, I think, has been particularly strong. So we should have optimism about our ability to suppress demand for drug use. It's not all about laws and those legislative responses. And we need better treatment. But we don't seem to talk about treatment. You know, the whole conversation about drug policy in Ireland for the last 10 years has been completely overshadowed by this relatively minor issue, because those intent on drug legalisation won't let it go. So it's the only thing we're allowed to talk about within the drug policy domain over the last decade. We don't talk about the big needs in terms of treatment, what we could or should be doing in terms of prevention.
I'm going to go to Deputy...
Someone who's spoken about both those things quite a lot.
Okay, so I'm going to go to Deputy Gina Kenny, and this is the final contribution then.
Thanks,
and
Chair.
I know there's a couple of witnesses have their hands up or have indicated, so you can come back as part of this round rather than, Deputy Gina.
Thanks, Chair. I just have a number of very, very quick questions for Dr. Smyth. Does he see any circumstances where cannabis can be used for medical purposes?
The evidence I've seen on cannabis as a product in itself as a medical treatment doesn't convince me. So no.
So you wouldn't support the medical cannabis access program that's in existence?
The access program for cannabis-based products seems to me to be an acceptable compromise, to be honest with you. I don't object to it. Right. I'm content enough with it.
But you don't, do you see cannabis in a medical form has any medical benefits? Do you see that?
Cannabis in itself smoked, no. It seems rather ridiculous to me that you would smoke a drug.
No. But do you see how it could medically benefit somebody in a different form rather than smoking?
I suppose perhaps my issue with it actually is the reference to it as a medicine. Once you say something as a medicine, it has to have proven effectiveness, proven safety profile. And unfortunately, For the cannabis plant, I don't think it's ever going to reach those criteria. I see cannabis more as an alternative therapy. Lots of people are passionate about a whole range of alternative therapies, homeopathy, crystal therapy. They'll swear, you know, by their chosen treatment. Cannabis, for me, falls in that domain. And I don't see it as a genuine medicine in and of itself. We currently do have Sativex, which is recognised as a medicine that contains THC and CBD, which are obviously cannabidiols derived from the cannabis plant.
Okay. Dr. McGovern, same question.
I just wondered, really, I'm not going to ask about Professor Smyth the question, but one of the reasons that cannabis, the evidence base for medical cannabis isn't as strong as it should be is that it's very hard to assess a drug that is illegal. We haven't invested, we've poo-pooed medical cannabis in this country largely. The medical profession largely have discarded it. So you would think that because the medical profession are calling for a greater evidence base that we'd support the research around that, but we are not doing that. My view on medical cannabis is very straightforward. The people I've dealt with in relation to medical cannabis, the people I've met and the stories I've heard, I think we need to understand that those people have the conventional medical treatments have not worked for those people. So the very treatments that have the strong evidence base, generally speaking, and well researched, have not worked. We have a situation which I believe is inhumane, and that is that people are forced to either break the law or leave this country to try something to see does it work for their symptoms. They're criminalised and they have to leave the country. And my view on medical cannabis is very straightforward. We talk about its effectiveness, but what about its safety? It seems to me, in countries that have medical cannabis, it seems to be fairly safe. I would accept Professor Smith's comments about the evidence base in relation to medical cannabis. It needs to be stronger. But that doesn't mean that we don't use it. There are many examples in the history of medicines where we didn't wait for the wonderful evidence base to arrive. Penicillin, probably one example, but also in the area I work in, methadone maintenance treatment. The evidence base was informed by practice and having to deal with an epidemic, and we couldn't wait around for the absolutely perfect evidence base. So I don't think medical cannabis is unsafe. I don't see any evidence it's unsafe, and the people who are trying it have tried every other conventional medicine. And I just think in this country we need to show a bit of humanity towards those people. It is not right for people to have to leave this country at great expense and great hardship, leave their families to go to another country to access a treatment that they can't access here.
Thank you, Doctor. And I'm going to give the last word to Mr. Minish. He's indicating for a while there on the screen. So, Mr. Minish, do you want to come in? And actually, this will be a concluding remark as well.
Yes, I just wanted to remark on something we've heard throughout today and remind us why we're here. And we're here because the rate of drug deaths in Ireland is very high. We are 3 times the EU average. We are the 4th worst in Europe for drug deaths. So if the policy is working, then, you know, goodness me, what else is going wrong? We need to do better. And we're not serving these people. Lots of people, obviously, who are getting into treatment are having reasonable outcomes. But there are a lot of people who are getting missed here, who are falling through the cracks and are coming to, who are dying from overdoses. And the problem here is, of course, in part, contaminated supply and all that goes with it in the black market. So I think it's premature to, you know, to assume that our policy as is working. It's not.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much to all of our witnesses that came before us today. That concludes our examination of this topic. I think it was a very useful debate, a lot of strong views. Actually, it's interesting. It's probably one of the more vehemently argued topics that we've had, actually. We've had many topics across a range of issues on this committee, but certainly the strong views around all sides of the House on this one, which is good because it makes for a more robust meeting. And we will, of course, produce a report. So everything that's been discussed here today and all the written submissions received and from others that weren't present in the meeting but would have sent us in their thoughts in advance will be distilled into a report that we will produce probably in the new term because we're approaching summer recess, but so that will be documented and the committee will then produce that in a couple of months' time. We have, yes, so we have we've listened and certainly learned, I think I have anyway, from all the speakers here today. So thank you to our witnesses. I'm just going to ask my members then for agreement that we would publish the opening statements on the committee website as per the norm. Is it agreed? It's agreed. Thank you again. And as there's no other business, the meeting then stands adjourned until, and I just remind members of the Joint Committee that we're back tomorrow at 3 p.m. for a housekeeping meeting prior to the recess to get our ducks in a row for the new term. And that concludes today's business. The committee stands adjourned, as I say, until tomorrow. And thank you again, particularly to both our online and our in-person witnesses and all that participate in the debate. Thank you.